And we're live. Hey, everybody. I'm Midwest Chicana on the Chicona podcast. And oh my gosh, I have been waiting so long to have this interview. And I'm so excited for Kansas City to meet a friend of mine who we just barely met, but she has become so phenomenal and just reaching out and being such a great contact in person. So welcome, everybody. Denise, Dr. Denise Sandoval. Hi, Denise.
Hello, or que vole, to keep up the Chicano vibe here.
Absolutely. I know. I'm the one that doesn't know Spanish very well, and I'm not going to butcher it here on this podcast.
Well, the good thing is que vole is slang, so yes. The Pachuco slang. So what's up?
That's there we go. So you're in California right now.
Mm-hmm. I'm in Los Angeles, California.
How's it out there right now, especially with all the COVID happening?
Well, we're being hit pretty strongly by COVID, especially Los Angeles County. And actually where I am right now, we're like one of the hot spots in East Los Angeles. So I think we're at close to around 3,000 cases right now.
Oh my gosh.
About 60 deaths. That's the last time I looked. But yeah, so they're talking out here about going back into stay-at-home orders because people are not wearing their masks and they're out and about at restaurants, even outside without masks, and the beaches, they close the beaches, they still show up. So here we are.
Yeah, it's like that way in Kansas City. It's like, wear your mask, people, please. Like, we don't want to be here in the home. Like, my kids and I have been in our house since March, and it's just been that normal. We don't do anything anymore. It's not fun, but we want to protect everybody too.
Yeah, and I was telling people, my family, I was like, this is not a struggle. Like, my grandmother lived through World War II. There's people alive that still lived World War II where they had to sacrifice. There were rationings. Like, that was hard, right? Like, not being able to go to a restaurant or a bar, do something like for a period of time, like, it's doable. There's a previous generation that really sacrificed and really united, right, for the greater good. But
yes.
Fingers crossed. You have to have hope.
Absolutely. So, Denise, you have not been to Kansas City, right?
I have not been to Kansas City. No.
Okay. So we will invite you with warm hugs and love when you get here, when COVID's all over.
Yes.
Because you need to come visit us out here. I know we've talked a lot about, what we do here. And I know you were very interested in what we do here as well, just by talking to me and then some of the people here as well.
Well, yeah, and just, being a Chicano Studies history professor, I do know about the Midwest, and the communities that have been in the Midwest since the early 20th century. So I think it's oftentimes an overlooked area, when we look at sort of Chicano history or Chicano settlement and culture, but it's important, especially even now in the 21st century, right? Like there's communities all across the U.S. that have Latino, Mexican immigrants.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I wanted you on here, because I know you and I met through an email chain from one of your amazing events way back in like 2018 after my Queer Eye show. And you were so gracious to respond and kind of say, hey, I seen your show. It's amazing and want to learn more. And so this is kind of how this all happened.
Yeah, it's one of those things that we were talking about. It's just crazy how the universe works, because when I watched that queer episode, I was like, this is a really great episode. And first of all, I had over the shock of seeing the word Chicano, like on Netflix and on a mainstream TV show. There was first that, and then it was you, and then looking at Lowriding, which obviously is my research interest, but also even dealing with the aesthetics, or the chola aesthetics, that I thought really was fascinating. And then always every episode's just very emotional when you watch it, right? When you see people on their journeys. So I thought, wow, that was great. But how we actually connected, I think it was after last summer, because I was presenting my work at the Getty, which is a well-known museum out in Los Angeles. And this student was part of that program. I didn't even know her. She wasn't my student. She just went to my lecture. And I guess she really liked what I said, and she had seen your episode. And so I just got a cold email from her.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, thank you. If you want to introduce us, blah, blah, blah. fine. Because, you know, we were talking about that before. Sometimes you see these amazing things in the world or online, and like part of you wants to reach out, but like I never do, right? But it was this little angel that we couldn't remember who her name was.
Yes.
But thank you.
Yeah,
because
thank
she
you.
she did an email introduction between us, and she didn't even know you. It was like a cold intro, you know, like, I think you two should meet. That's, I think, what she said.
Yes, she did.
And then we talked on the phone. That was like probably like last September, October, somewhere around there, when I was working on the Viva Viclas exhibit for North Carolina, which was the first art exhibit to feature lowrider motorcycles, and it was at Raleigh, North Carolina. So we had our conversation back then. So yeah, so it's just great. Like, I always feel like it's another reminder of like when you're supposed to meet somebody, like the universe makes it happen. So.
Well, and it's so funny how the universe works, because my episode got aired just because of Rachel Mendez, who also is a Chicana, and she's from Texas, and she's a producer on Queer Eye. So it was just funny how this whole thing just chained out, and it continues to chain out. So I'm just gracious. I'm so glad that you're here, and let's get started, because I want everyone to know all about you and the amazing stuff that you've told me and your work. So let's start with that. So where are your beginnings? Okay. And how did you end up what you're doing now with Chicano studies?
So, like, my family history is sort of that classic, you know, East Los Angeles story. You know, my mother grew up in East Los Angeles. My dad in Lincoln Heights, which is still Northeast LA. They were both born here. So my grandparents on my mom's side, they came from Mexico City during World War II, legally. And that's how she was born here. So she grew up in East LA. And then my dad's side, the Sandoval line, actually goes back generations to Albuquerque. And my grandfather came out here also during World War II for work, because he was an only child, to work in the defense industry. And that's where he met my grandmother, who she came here during the Depression from Mexico. So, you know, my parents were born here. They grew up in Motown kids, you know, 60 kids, Beach Boy kids. And then my dad's a Vietnam vet, you know, so they got married young at like 20, and they had me at like 22. My mom had me at 22, and I grew up just 20 minutes east of East LA in a city called La Puente. Chicano, you know, working class Chicano community, survived 12 years of Catholic school. Low riding was in my community, even though I didn't know any lowriders personally. But I was really into school and studying, and really college was like drilled into me from a young age that you're going to go to college, because my parents didn't go to college, but they ended up going back to school. Like my dad, when I was in high school, got his college degree, and my mom went back to school when I returned from Berkeley one summer, because she saw I was taking Chicano studies class, and she was like, this is my neighborhood where I grew up, right? And it inspired her to go back to school, and she majored in Chicano studies.
Wow.
And she graduated from Cal State Fullerton, and she graduated in 2002 with her degree in Chicano studies. My sister graduated in 2002 from UC Riverside in English, and my brother in 2002 got his Ph.D. in history from UC Berkeley, and he's a Chicano historian as well. I got my Ph.D. the next year, 2003, so I just missed out. But I think that's where, you know, my family story is also important, right? Because we were all always into education. Me and my brother, you know, we're two academics in Chicano studies. My brother is a professor at Pomona College, which is one of the Claremont colleges, which is about maybe a half an hour outside of downtown LA without traffic. So when I landed on the campus of UC Berkeley, it was January of 1991. I transferred from the community college. We were in, I forget which war we were in at that time, but it was a very political climate, the 90s at UC Berkeley. There were like attacks on ethnic studies, you know, the war, apartheid, all of these things. And Berkeley just changed my life. You know, it was the first time, like, I remember walking across campus and they were having like a legalized marijuana, you know, and they had this 100, like, it seemed like it was 100 feet. I'm probably exaggerating. Let's say 50. It was a big marijuana joint. Yeah. And I was like, where is this place? You know, because, you know, I came out of 12 years at Catholic school, you know, kind of conservative. But Berkeley just woke me up, you know, in the 90s, you know, and that's, you know, the riots happened in 92, and people were walking out at Berkeley in that time. So I think the 90s and the political climate and Berkeley itself, UC Berkeley shaped me, because that's where I took my first Chicano studies class. First time I heard the word Chicano. I had always, I think we had talked about this before, I think for me, in education, I was always drawn to like Black writers or Native American writers, because that was the only other stories I got in my education of K through 12. And I think Berkeley gave me the language to understand why I was connecting to James Baldwin, right? Or why I was connecting to the writings of Chief Joseph and the Nez Percés during the, genocide years. So I think for me, I think Berkeley gave me my Chicana consciousness, and I was able to take classes about my culture, my history. But I think it was, when I look back, even through K-12, I always felt like drawn to the other stories, meaning the non-white histories or books, right? Or other learning that I was doing in school. And so once I took my first Chicano studies class at Berkeley, I was hooked, and I think at Berkeley, they also gave me, they strengthened that, like, we need more people getting PhDs, right? We have to write more books on our culture, on our history. Who's going to write them? Like, you're the next generation. And obviously Berkeley was a campus that was, an important site for political struggle in the 60s and 70s. Students took over the administration buildings to create ethnic studies, to create Chicano studies. So like, I think even that political history of the generation before inspired me to think about, like, what is my generation, Generation X, right, going to do? What's our contribution? And so actually at UC Berkeley is where I found old issues of Lowrider magazine, because they had a Chicano studies library. It doesn't exist anymore because now they built a big ethnic studies library. And I found old issues of Lowrider magazine from the 70s, and I was flipping them, going like, this is amazing, because there were mostly stories and mostly pictures of our community, not a lot of TNA. And I think I even did a women's studies project using on video of Lowrider magazine. So it's just funny that, like, all these years, in 1999 or 98, 99 is when I, did my first curating gig, right? So this was 93, like 92, 93 at Berkeley. So I think for me, it was pretty quick.
Yeah, and it looks like Denise, someone from Luis is actually saying Desert Storm in 92, riots, Rodney King in 94, protest against Proposition 187, and then that's what drove.
Well, the riots were 92. Yeah, riots were 92, and then when I was so from Berkeley, I went to Cal State Northridge, where I'm actually teaching, and I was a master's student. And so we were very active against 187. Yeah, and that was in 94. But it was like really, and also like on our campus, there was a lot of cultural movement happening at CSUN. So after Berkeley, I ended up at CSUN, or Cal State Northridge. We had like Aslan Underground, which was like a Chicano rap group. In fact, even Rage Against the Machine did one of their first college shows in 92, 93 at Cal State Northridge, somewhere around there. Like, I wasn't a student then. So so we were very active in protesting and, Proposition 187, and then years after that, when I was working on my PhD, we had like the end of affirmative action, just a attack on gay marriage, but which of course didn't pass at that time. So the 90s were a really formative time period for me. And I knew that I wanted to be a professor. And so for that, you'd have to go get your PhD. So I ended up, after I got my master's in Chicano studies at Cal State Northridge, my whole goal was like, I'm going to get my PhD. I'm going to come back to Cal State Northridge and teach. And that's exactly what happened. But I ended up getting my PhD in cultural studies at Claremont Graduate University. And I started in the fall of 95. So I'm old.
No, you are not old at all. I mean, just hearing that part of it, which is like a snippet of, like, I'm sure the amazingness within all of that. Because I am just so envious of the culture that you have embraced and that you're sharing with your students. I'm just like in awe of it because I think you just mentioned like you realized that you were this Chicana, because of what this school offered, and to be able to bring that out loud. Because I think for a lot of us, we don't have that in school, right? I'm the same way. I identified with the Black culture, or other stories that were non-white because we didn't talk about the Chicanos, and especially not here in the Midwest. I feel like it's becoming more open now, but I totally understand when you say that.
Yeah, and I think for my own family, where it sort of missed my parents is like they were already married, right? So when the Chicano movement, all of this was happening, my dad was in Vietnam, like they weren't in the high schools, this wasn't happening. So there was like a little bit of distance, and they were dealing with other issues, like my dad potentially dying in Vietnam. When you grew up, especially in the 70s and in the 80s in particular, it was like the decade of the Hispanic, right? And they were calling you Hispanic, and you just called yourself Hispanic, right? Because that's what they told you, that's what you were, right? And right. I think that Berkeley was the first time that I realized, like, I remember as I started taking more classes, I went from, I know I'm not Hispanic, because they told me how the history of the word was created. It was like sort of this government agency that decided what would be a good word, because they were using like Spanish surname before. And so they created that Hispanic, right? It was from Hispano, obviously, but it sort of highlights a lot of our whiteness of our identity and sort of hides sort of the indigenous and even the Black roots that exist. And there's even Asian roots that exist in Latin America. So I knew I wasn't Hispanic. So then I went like, oh, okay, I'm Mexican American. And then by the time I graduated Berkeley, I was like, I'm Chicana, right? But it was just interesting to see sort of that identity shaping. And I see it in my students too. I teach like a good mix of like first time college freshmen to like upper division. And it's the same thing, like they're learning this new language. They're learning, how their identity or how they view themselves, how the world views them. And that's why I love teaching, because it's like really helping students, giving them a language, filling in gaps to their knowledge, but allowing them, right, to have that power to be critical thinkers and potentially, like I always tell my students, like you have to be agents for social change, right? Yeah. The social justice is about action. And I say, like a lot of times they're telling us that knowledge is power. And I don't completely agree with that. What you do with that knowledge is where power, the power imbalance happens, right? So it's Absolutely. That first step, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that for me, sort of like growing up in the time period that I did, the decade of the Hispanic, it definitely like influenced, how we viewed ourselves. But I think being exposed to Chicano studies, and then also, I was actually an ethnic studies major at Berkeley, Chicano studies minor, which was important because looking at the cross comparative analysis, right, to looking at, what Chicanos share with African Americans, with Native Americans, Asian Americans, a lot of the Chicano history, especially in California, is very much linked to the Asian migration from China, from Japan, from the Philippines, right? Because a lot of these workers were working in the same jobs that Chicanos and Mexicans were working, right, in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So I think that cross-comparative analysis is really good. And a book I could recommend to people, that he was my professor at Berkeley. I use his book in my class, Ronald Takaki. It's called A Different Mirror, A Multicultural History of the United States. And that book is amazing because what he argues is that people of color, we share more, right? Marginalized groups, we share more than we're dissimilar. And we've all contributed to building this country through the work that we've done. We've like, for instance, we worked side by side on the railroads, or we worked in the factories, we worked in the fields. So I think like, that's why I love teaching U.S. history from the perspective of people of color, or as like Howard Zinn says, the losers of history, right? Because he argues, how history books are written by the winners, right? And the winners sort of normalize their power. So I think like having that training from Berkeley and professors like that inspired me even today in the work that I do in the classroom. And, I teach classes on Chicano culture at Cal State Northridge, but also U.S. history classes as well. And gender and women's studies and feminism.
Everything. And this is like, we could have like a million podcasts with you because this is so amazing. Okay. What was his name? Rodney?
Oh, Ronald Takaki. Ronald Takaki. Okay, a different year. Yeah.
And do you know how to spell his last name? I was going to put it on the comments.
Oh, Takaki. It's a Takaki. Takaki. He was Japanese American. He's dead, but yeah, he was lucky. He was my professor, and at Berkeley, and then I still use his books in my class today.
So Denise, I'm going to ask you a question that I get asked a lot, and especially being here in the Midwest, there's a lot of people learning and want to be, more, understanding of the Chicano culture. Mm-hmm. What does Chicano mean? Like, what does it mean? Yeah,
that's like a whole lecture. I mean, obviously, I know it's, what does it mean? I mean, I think like when we sort of think about Chicano as a political cultural label, right? You have to go to the Chicano movement, right? So the Chicano movement sort of used a term that had been used in the United States, but as a derogatory term of kind of meaning like a lower class Mexican, right? Mm-hmm. And I've even heard some Chicano professors and scholars say, well, Chicano sort of descends from the word Mexicano, right? Because the Mexicas were the Aztecs. What they called themselves were Mexicas. The Spaniards called them the Aztecs. So that Mexica, Mexicano, right? Chicano, right, is sort of like a short version of that. So there's also that indigenous connection as well. But I think the Chicano movement, right, really sort of began this period of we're going to name ourselves, right? This is what we choose to sort of name us and to name us. But more importantly, it's that we're Mexican heritage and we're American, right? So embracing sort of both those cultures. And I think it's the same way of thinking about how the Black Power movement embraced the term Black, right? It was Black power, like we had Chicano power, right? Black is beautiful, brown is beautiful. And I think this is really important because the way we challenged white supremacy was by what we call ourselves and reclaiming a culture that white supremacy had said is less than. And we're saying, no, our culture has just as value as white European culture. And we have to reclaim that because that is tied to self-esteem, right? Having pride, right? And we demand, right, full citizenship. So I think like culture became the tool to build sort of this political movement. It was essential, right? And you sort of think about like, when I always teach this period to my students, I love it because it's still at play today. We could have a discussion present, but back then, right, you sort of think about in the 60s, you had the hippies, right? You had, Black power, Chicano power, Native American power, the women movement, and all just those examples I'm giving you, there's more, queer liberation, Stonewall, all of those movements were dealing with culture and naming, right? And saying our culture is beautiful, our culture we demand full rights. So culture was that point of a resource, and also critiquing, right, the way that sort of white culture sort of diminishes our experiences. And I think it's, when you sort of think about like Motown music in that time period, or Aretha Franklin, Respect, James Brown, I'm Black and I'm Proud, right? How the music that our community was creating was mirroring, right, this time period. We've had it. Our culture has value. And I think that's why art is so important, why lowriding is so important, why music, all cultural forms and expressions are important, because it's a way that we create, not only do we exist, but our cultures and our identities have value, right? Yes. And we shouldn't have to be ashamed of these cultures. And I think that's the way we sort of challenge sort of like white supremacy, it's like, it gives us power, and that's like when I always tell students, I'm also hip hop generation, I'm Gen X, also hip hop generation. Like when you sort of think about, that was created by Black and Latino youth, right? In sort of like New York, and it has roots in sort of the Latin American diaspora, the African diaspora, but it was the same way. Like, how are we going to create music? We're going to use records. We're going to use our voice. We're going to use our bodies and dance. We don't have access to museums. We're going to use graffiti in our communities, right? But it was a way of using space, right? Using our communities and trying to change and fight sort of the white supremacist narrative, right? That has always attempted to erase us, you know? So I think it's amazing that even something like hip hop, just like lowriding, has gone global, right? So that how other cultures today are contributing to the lowrider movement, or even hip hop, right? So something that started here and had specific connections to our histories and our communities, even people outside of the U.S. still are able to apply, right? Sort of the feeling, the philosophy, the aesthetics to their own, right, countries or their own neighborhoods. In, you know, international spaces.
And okay, we're going to talk about the lowriders here in just one second, but Luis did bring up a good question that I was going to ask you as well. And he asked, what was your experience with the brown berets on the campuses you attended? Because here in Kansas City, that has been brought up, especially with the Black movement happening now, about the brown berets.
My campus, my educational experience, it was mostly mecha. Yeah, this is mostly mecha. So there, mecha. Yeah. Mecha. It's just, I don't know what else to say. It was mecha.
Yeah. So what does that mean, mecha? Just in case anybody else doesn't.
It's the Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán. So that was the student group that was responsible for creating Chicano studies out here in California around 68, 69. There was the Plan de Santa Barbara. You could look it up. That sort of created a template of how they would create Chicano studies departments from like K through 12 through higher ed. And so Mecha was sort of the student sort of activist group, right? Mecha, M-E-C-H-A, no T, Mecha. So that was really important because like even in my department, like Mecha, there's like regional, you know, every campus has a Mecha and they have their conference, and they had sort of a controversy this last year because they voted to sort of like change their name.
Is there
because they said it was, they were saying that it was anti-Black and not exclusive to Indigenous people. But I just felt like if you go back to the history, there was always connections to like African Americans and Indigenous culture. But I think it's just like how the newer generation, and I think this is, maybe we have to do a better job of having intergenerational dialogue, but of going back and looking at historical moments. But like on our campus, you know, Mecha is sort of like the activist group, you know, on our campus. And we have a lot of actually activist student groups on our campus. At Cal State Northridge, we're a pretty strong student activist campus. But I think like it was important for us to always include students in that they have also an interest in the Chicano Studies department. And they also have, they always know what we're, you know, as professors, what we're doing, and just keeping them part of the dialogue.
And I love what you said about the fact of intergenerational conversations, because I feel like that is so important, because if you don't understand where it's coming from or the roots of it, and those people that actually gave us this pathway to even be in this space right now, I feel like we've lost and we're losing just this huge piece of who we are. And that's one thing that we're trying to do here in Kansas City, especially with podcasts like this, is to ensure that we're even talking about our Kansas City Chicano roots, because a lot of us don't even know about, you know, how that is, you know, what started it, how did it even begin, anything like that. So I just feel like that's so important.
No, I mean, the history is important, and you have to go back and you have to learn it. And I think that's the reality, that sometimes people will say, oh, you know, they see things in one way. Or I think now, because we're in this sort of Instagram culture, so people do a meme or people do an Instagram and they take that as the fact. When there's another side of like doing research. If anything, it's easier to do research now, right, through Google. Like, you know, I'm of that generation. When I started researching lowriding, I actually had to go into the library and use the computer at the library. Because if you remember, like, even in the 90s, if you dialed into a library, you had to put in all these codes, you know, like DOS this, DOS. It was like so complicated, right? It was just easier to go to the library.
Yes.
In our libraries, we had those little cards. We had blue.
I just don't even know what those are.
Oh my God.
I can't even imagine. It took forever just to even get the card.
Yeah, so I feel like we're even in a time period where you can do the research, right? But people, maybe they're just not everybody, but maybe some people, they think, oh, it's take too much time, or it's lazy. But I think in general, there's no excuse for doing, the work of researching, history, and you can access so much online that's free.
So, Denise, I want to talk about the Lowriders now, because you have some amazing culture, history.
Yeah.
You've even been photographed with some amazing people that I'm just so envious, and I'm just like, wow, just to even, just all that you've embraced. Because I'm just going to give you a quick touch base of what it's been like here in Kansas City. When we did the Queer Eye show, I think for a lot of people, people knew about what was happening, but they didn't really realize the culture in itself in regards to, it's so family based. The men and women are artists, they create amazing pieces of work with their own hands, and there's many parts to it. Because when my husband started his shop here about 20 years ago, he's from Mexico City. He doesn't say he's Chicano, but he's very much Mexican and, from Mexico. And but he embraces the lowrider culture, and he has been his whole life. And so he had an apprentice actually teach him. So I feel like even in that piece of it, those trades are getting lost here in Kansas City because our apprentices are not here any longer. And it's like, where do you learn how to do something like this? And unless we're teaching our kids to continue to do this, it's lost. Just like pinstriping is like a huge thing, I feel like, is getting lost as well. But when my husband was trying to begin his shop, we had a lot of stereotypes on us, and to where the Hispanic community, the ones in the organizations, did not even want to support him because in that time, 20 years ago, even now, people may still think this, it was drug dealing. It was, the money was no good. You were just classified as a gangster.
Yeah, gangster on wheels.
Yes, exactly. And now, 20 years later, they're like, oh my gosh, you're doing amazing. And for him, it's just been hard because it's like he built something by himself that he could have had the support of the community way back then, if they had understood what lowriding was. So please tell us in Kansas City what lowriding is and the history and where this comes from.
Well, I think for me, the connection, like I've said, I found lowrider magazines at Berkeley, and like taking Ronald Takaki's class, it was this idea that, who's going to tell our stories, right? And so I was really drawn to the history and oral history. And even at Berkeley, my senior project, I did an oral history on the lives of my grandmother. I interviewed them. So like I loved oral history, doing interviews and history, community history. And then when I entered into my Ph.D. program and I was taking a class on popular culture, they said, you're going to have to choose a culture to study. So I went to Tower Records, which was a record store out here that doesn't exist anymore, to get inspiration. You know how record stores have disappeared. I went to get inspiration, and I walked past a magazine rack. This was like 96, 97, and something caught my eye. I backtracked, and it looked like Lowrider magazine, but it was in Japanese, and there was a Japanese girl on the cover. When I flipped the magazine, their magazines open up the other way, and I go, what is this? I saw Japanese cats, dressed like cholos and homies, and, I was like, what is this? Lowriding is in Japan,
Right.
So then I ended up writing a paper in that class on sort of like Lowrider magazine and Chicano identity, a little bit of Japan. And I thought this would be a great topic for a dissertation because there wasn't a lot of writing. And like my mom grew up in East LA. My grandmother's house is like a half a block from Whittier Boulevard, the heart of, Chicano lowriding, even to this day. And so I thought this is an important story. But like I said, even though my family roots were there, like I didn't know any lowriders, but I still wrote my paper, and I realized it's more than just cars, right? Cars is the way that we are writing our history, talking about our culture, creating power, right? Sort of using space, using cars as a resource, right? To say I exist, look at me, my culture has value. So I recognized that very early on. And then also, you see the early issues of Lowrider magazine, and they're using the word Chicano. They're even talking about issues in the Chicano movement. So it was like, I would argue, it was a political magazine. The guys who started Lowrider magazine, Sonny Madrid, Larry Gonzalez, started it at San Jose State, right? It's one of the sister campuses of Northridge. They were working there, and they were having car shows. San Jose is in the Bay Area, Northern California. They were having car shows for Cesar Chavez and the farm workers. And they had this idea to do a magazine, and they were active in doing like what we would consider zines of like poetry, Chicano art. And they said, we need to do a Lowrider, and so from the beginning, they saw it as not just a cultural magazine, but a political, magazine. So I think that's why it has that sort of sense to it in the first sort of stage of the magazine. So then in the class, I wrote my paper. My teacher was really good, but I was like, how am I going to do a dissertation? I don't know any clubs. How am I going to do this? It's a great idea. But again, the universe, right? It has a higher plan for us. So literally 6 months after I wrote that paper, the Petersen Automotive Museum was looking to hire the first community researcher, guest curator, to curate the first exhibit on low riding. This was like fall in 98. And I literally had just turned in my paper May of 1998, and this was like November of 1998. So I applied and I got the gig. And so then that allowed me, sort of that input into like going to car shows, saying, hey, I'm working for the Petersen, doing this exhibit. And all the guys out in LA, all the old East Side clubs, like they know the Petersen, because they know that museum. It mostly was featuring like hot rods and sport cars. I think the exhibit that was there before ours was like a Woody exhibit, which were like the Woodies were those cars that surfers would use, right? Mm-hmm. So they realized that it was important that Petersen was going to feature their culture, and because they saw themselves as artisans, as contributors to the automotive history in the United States on the same level as hot rods, right? Which tended to be mostly white guys that have hot rods. So even out here in LA, there were Black and Chicano hot rodders too. So that history is even, I think, kind of hidden. So that experience, I was like 26, 27 when I got hired being a curator. That's how I met Esteban, Oriol, and Khartoum, right? And they were just, coming up. They were still like, I think Esteban was still even working for Cypress Hill at that time. And I got connected to them through a mutual friend, and I met them, and that was like 99. So we've been friends for like over 20 years. And I've worked with Esteban Oriol on various projects over time, but I think we all met each other when we were like really coming up, I was in my Ph.D. program, Cartoon, he was having some success, obviously, even back then. It was tattooing Eminem shortly after that. And Esteban, was photography. And so I think, meeting them, and also through the first exhibit, I was able to meet like Fernando Ruelas and Julio Ruelas of the Duke's Car Club, who are like OGs, Jesse Valadez of Gypsy Rose, Joe Ray of Lifestyle. And because Esteban and Cartoon were lowriders themselves, they also introduced me to a lot of people. So I met like a lot of the old timers and got all of their interviews, and consistently, even like Fernando and certain people I've interviewed over time, right? So I think that experience was great because it introduced me to the culture. And I think they really embraced me because here was this young Chicana working on her PhD. My family roots are East LA, so that sort of gave me cred. Yes. But also, again, like somebody like Fernando Ruelas, who definitely was like my mentor, he would even ask me questions like, about, okay, how do you do this? He would always make sure like what I know to make sure I was getting it right. And I love that because, I have such a responsibility, even to this day, like here I am speaking with you, or if I get invited to speak on low riding, I always say like, it's a privilege for me to share these stories, to share my culture, right? Because I'm able to take these stories and put them in areas that maybe people have never heard about low riding, or as you mentioned, people have stereotypes. Because there's that negative stereotype of low riding and low riders, right? And what, like you exactly said, it's like, it's family. A lot of the clubs in East LA are like very philanthropic. Like I mentioned, car clubs were having fundraisers for Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers. They were active in the Chicano movement. People like the Dukes, Fernando was definitely a part of that, and the Dukes. So, and Jesse Valadez, and so I think it's important, like, people lose that, right? That there was a time period where, like, the lowriders were, kind of putting murals on their car. Like, when you talk to people weren't really putting murals on their car as much. They got inspired by what was happening in the Chicano movement, right? And when murals started hitting their walls, they, started saying, oh, we could put, like, really detailed murals on our cars. So I think, like, that synergy, right, also shaped lowriding. Yeah. And also shaped, obviously, the founders of Lowrider magazine, right, when they created it. So it's all connected to the Chicano movement, right, in that time period. And then, so I think in doing the first exhibit, even to this day, I think I always realize people are going to come with negative ideas of what lowriding is, right? And so my job is to, like, I'm telling the story that's authentic to the lowriders and their voice. And I want to challenge sort of that dominant narrative that just sees lowriders as gangsters on wheels or as cholos, right? Or they don't look at them as, there's, even in LA, I mean, there's lowriders that are policemen, lawyers, doctors, right? And then there's guys that are working on cars or have their own businesses. There's a whole sort of, like, diversity to the scene. And today there's a lot more, you mentioned that, a lot more women getting involved in lowriding and learning how to customize and, be pinstripers, how to build. And I think that has really happened in the last, out here, I want to say maybe in the last 5 years, 6 years. And what it takes is some of the men opening up their doors, so to speak, and saying, you can be my apprentice. Right? Yeah. And I think this generation, which are mostly men in our 40s, they're, because they have daughters, they're much more open to, they're not as, like, sort of fearful of, like, because some of the old timers would say, we can't have women in the club because women just bring in fighting and the men will just fight over them. But what's funny is, in all the years that I've done research on lowriding, like, this group has issues with so-and-so, I'm not naming any, and this group doesn't get with this. Like, they're, like, to be gender stereotypical, like, and this doesn't exist. I'm saying they're worse than women, or the stereotype of how they say women, how they talk about each other, they're chismosos, and they're holding on to something that, like, happened on the boulevard 20 years ago, And so I was like, oh my God, this is hilarious, right? It's like a whole telenovela behind the scenes. And the lowriding scene, somebody needs to write that book, right? They do. But not me. I don't want to get in trouble. But you hear all these stories, right? And so you think, like, men have so much drama too. That was what I'm saying.
No, 100%. And I'm a lowrider wife, and I have grown up with lowriders. My dad actually had a band called Los Chicanos. So him and his brothers all started this, but then two of his brothers actually did customizing and lowriding back in their garages. So I grew up with that, but they never had a shop. They just had people come and drop off their cars, and they did them in their backyard and did all the paint and everything themselves. But I'll have to tell you, it is the women that are a part of those clubs that really keep it standing. I mean, they work hard for the culture and like the planning of events and things like that happen, especially here in Kansas City. A lot of it is the wives or the girlfriends or the daughters, that get involved and really try to ensure that the club is doing good and that the events are going the way they should. And so I have to give props definitely to the women behind the scenes that keep these clubs going.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. You hit it right on the nail. Is that for a lot of people, like, that their role, people miss it, right? Yes. And when you're in it, and when I would start, interviewing and I would see just the strong role that women play. Yeah. Or people wouldn't realize, like, I remember talking to Gloria Ruelas, the wife of Fernando. Hello, Gloria, maybe she's watching. And she would say, look, there's discussions in the home about if money's going to be spent on this and that, right? Yes. Like, so this, and even that's important to add, right? That there's this negotiation. And, like, Gloria was, like, the club custodian for the Dukes, right? So this is important, right? They're not just sitting around going to the car shows or, women draped on the cars, right? In their sexy bikinis. So I think that was in doing these exhibits, now we've accomplished 3 exhibits at the Petersen. The first one was in 2000, Arte en Estilo, and that focused on Chicano lowriding, and that was their most popular exhibit, and we were breaking attendance records. So then almost about 10 years, around 7 years later, '07, we did another exhibit, La Vida Lowrider, Cruising the City of Angels, which focused on Chicano and Black lowriders and LA identity. And I think one of the things, as I mentioned, I think for me, it's like as an educator, I thought, well, people are going to come and learn about lowriders, but guess what? They're going to come and learn about the Zoot Suit riots. They're going to learn about the Chicano movement. So like I would write these big text panels so that people would learn more, right? Because you can't understand the cars without understanding the cultural context and the history and the politics that they emerge from. And so we had that. And then the last exhibit we did in 2017 was the High Art of Riding Low. And that one I loved because it was Chicano art. So it was like Chicano art and low riding. So we took Chicano artists as well as lowrider artists. And we used the lowrider car as subject. So it was like how artists, how they're redefining and transforming our meaning of the lowrider car through their art.
Oh, wow.
And that was a great exhibit because one of my favorites were a group of women, queer women from the Bay Area, the Q-Sides. And they like queered images of like traditional images that are like on the lowrider oldie albums. It's always like an old car, like a bomb, heterosexual couple, and that's sort of the cover of the lowrider music. So they took that idea and then they queered them. So then they put like a drag queen dressed as Frida in front of a lowrider, or a same-sex couple, or a mom that reads more masculine by her son, right? And so they really played with that idea of sort of like low riding, that we're also part of low riding, and also thinking about that what happens of like when they're sort of critiquing sort of the machismo and the sexism and the heteronormativity of the culture. And so that was, I feel like that show, I was sort of like, probably took the 20 years of me being a professor because, I had a lot of connections in the Chicano art scene. Another big mentor of mine was also Gilbert Magoo Lujan, who was one of the first Chicano artists to kind of use the lowrider car in the 60s in his artwork. He's also sadly passed away. I think in doing my research, I think one of the things that really makes me like emotional, but also I feel honored of sharing the stories, is I've lost a lot of my informants, like the people that I interviewed, both from the Chicano art scene and the lowrider art scene, and now even losing their sons, like, when you lose sort of like Jesse Valadez, senior and junior, and Fernando died in 2010, and Jason, right, died like last year, 2 years ago, or going on 2 years ago. So it's the importance of why these stories are so important, that not only do we collect them, but we share them, because this is American culture.
It is. I love that you said that, because that's exactly what it is. And I think people need to start realizing that. And it's part of us. I mean, it's part of them. It's a part of this whole thing here. And so I want you to go back just a little bit, because I've mentioned the name Mr. Cartoon and Esteban many, many, many times in Kansas City. There are people that know who they are, but a lot of people do not. Can you give a little bit of background of who these amazing artists are in California?
Well, I would probably recommend that they watch the Netflix movie, LA Originals, because it has so much detail in how they started. But I feel like they're both such, like, this word, like, influencers, right? That's the new word. But I mean, they've been doing this for like 25 years. They've been influencing the culture. So Cartoon, is an artist that, like he'll say, sort of started, was always a good drawer and had parents that encouraged him, and started with graffiti, moved on to tattoos, then applied that to doing like album covers for Snoop Dogg and Cypress Hill, to doing murals on lowriders. And then him and Esteban met. And I think when he was working for Cypress Hill, they became friends, and Esteban was a photographer. Same thing. Like, I think the thing about both of them is that they were artists and had this skill. Like, they didn't go to art school, they just had this skill, did the work. Like, they're both two of the hardest working men that I know and hustlers that put in the work. Like Cartoon will tell you, when he started to be a tattoo artist, he was an apprentice, right? And he'll like, sometimes younger people will be like, I want to do what you do. And he'll be, well, if you're going to be in my apprentice for a year, he's just going to have you stenciling or outlining. And they're like, they like want to go in a month, learn how to be on the tattoo machine. And he's like, you're not going to go on the tattoo machine yet, right? You're going to do all, because that's what he did. So he was always saying how young people, they don't have no patience, right? Or to like this, to put in the blood, sweat, and tears, right? Which they did, right? And I think that's, and who knows how people long they'll last, because it takes work and it takes grind and it takes, and keep improving whatever you're doing. Every day you're doing something to get at sort of that level. So so Esteban started picking up a camera when he was on tour with Cypress Hill, and ended up shooting a lot of the hip hop, like the Smoking Grooves tour, where like Erykah Badu and Outkast and Common. This was like in the 90s. And then every country he would go, he would be taking pictures on the road. So then he started publishing some of his photos in a lot of hip hop magazines, and then they were lowriders themselves too, through Lifestyle Car Club. So they were also active in the lowrider scene as well. And so I think like just they were so good in the art that they were doing. I think that's where they were getting the attention of like, I think like even Cartoon even mentions that in the documentary, and mentioned it to me. I think as soon as he sort of tatted like Eminem, right, things started like shifting. And then other celebrities started sort of coming to him. But now he's like customized Nikes, Vans. Like I remember like 15 years ago, like T-Mobile, was what he was doing that line. So I think what's interesting, and that still happens today, is that corporate America always looks to the streets, looks to urban culture, what the youth are interested in. And that's how lowriding, and they'll use it to sell something,
yes.
Right? And they'll appropriate it, and that always exists for everything. Hip hop, same way. But like I always argued, like let's say corporate America says, "Oh, lowriding, it's so old. We're not going to do it." That doesn't mean people are going to stop lowriding, right? Or we're not going to stop living the culture and loving the culture. It just means that corporate America is going to stop, making money off of us. But I think it's important, right, that we are out there, like what's on Netflix or even on TV screens, commercials, right, because it gets out our culture to a broader audience and even international audience. But I think it also, you could look at how even some of that culture also plays with what you said in the beginning, stereotypes, right? People still have, stereotypes of who lowriders are, right? But I think But I think the theme that always comes back, and you mentioned that earlier, is that when I would do lowriding interviews, I always ask, what does it mean to be a lowrider to you? Yeah. And what's interesting, I don't say anything. That's my first question. They say the same thing. The lowriding is about pride. It's about respect. It's about honor. It's about brotherhood. It's about family, right? Yeah. It's about hard work. It's about corazon. Like, so they have an understanding that doesn't match, right, the dominant culture's stereotypes of who we are.
Denise, you're going to make me start crying, and I hate doing this. I feel like I cry at every freaking podcast, but lowriding is so, I was born with it, right? It's been in my family forever. And just because I don't look, as some people are just like, really, just because I don't talk or look in some form that people think that a lowrider person should, they're always questionable about that. But meeting my husband, and like you said, the universe works in a weird way. I met him at a lowrider show here in Kansas City that I was just talking to another person who now is in San Diego, and his mom actually created the first lowrider show with Lowrider magazine here in Kansas City. And so it was kind of funny that universe was like crazy that his mom did that. I met my husband there, and it's just a weird thing. But I'm so glad that you brought all of this knowledge and base here to this podcast, because I think that is something that Kansas City needs to hear. I can only talk about my own city that I live in. I'm hoping that the Midwest, I know you mentioned to me that there's amazing people out in Colorado. I know we know
New Mexico, Arizona, Texas.
And my husband's actually a part of a car club in Las Vegas, and it's a black car club, and there's not many Latinos in there. So he's embraced and loved, and they're amazing, and they do great work. And so it's just, it's such an inclusive. I tell it to everybody. I'm like, if everybody could be like the Lowrider community, we could probably be a better space here in the world, because I feel like we just always feel like, we have a way to unite and to build this community, that of just this art that is around us.
Yeah, and it's so true, because whether it be hip hop or low riding, like culture brings people together, right? And so I learn about you and you learn about me. So I think that's one of the things, is that low riding is not just Chicano, right? African Americans, there's white guys, there's Asian Americans, right? Native Americans that are involved in low riding. And especially like in LA, there was a lot of work between sort of like Black and Chicano car clubs, because of that time period. We were both struggling for equality, right? We were both struggling for a place in the Los Angeles cultural landscape. So I think there's always this idea that like people don't get along, right, of different cultures. But I see the opposite, right? Because you look at places like hip hop, because it's about the music. Low riding is about the car. Skateboarding, it's about how you do the trick, right?
Yes.
And so that becomes the bridge, right? That brings people that would seem that we have nothing in common, but not only do we have commonality, but we're also learning about each other's differences. And that is also what social justice is about in our everyday lives. And it's not just about appreciating cultures, but it's like understanding different cultures and how they relate to my own culture or to this larger, right, American landscape.
You hit it perfectly. I love it. I love you, Denise. I mean, you talk in a way that is just so understandable to all of us, and in a way of like you live it, you empathize with it, you are a part of it. And I think that is missing in a lot of conversations, that happen. It's like if you don't live it and breathe it and have been a part of it, you can't really tell someone else how to do the same.
No, and it's true. And I think that even again, why our cultures matter so much, and why our voices, or putting tattoos, or that skateboard trip, or that low rider, or that breakdance move. I mean, they're powerful resources. And I think that is the time period that we're living in, where there's this sort of backlash, this sort of white racism is rearing its head again. It's like some people are fearful of that, and they're attempting to break us and silence us. And we can't do that. We have to continue to fight, continue to share our stories, that we are American, right? And, I think that work can be done like in a classroom, in a college classroom, could be done on CNN, could be done on a podcast, is being done on the streets, like through low riding, every day.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, Denise, I could talk to you like for hours, and we're going to have another podcast again. I'm 100% sure. I want to introduce your work behind you, because there's artwork behind you. Can you tell us quickly, like, who did the artwork? It's beautiful.
So my cousin, I have come over from a family of educators. My cousin is EDD2, is like a principal, comes out of education, and he does art for his own sort of like, therapy and healing. So he has like a Si Se Puede. Like, I think what he did is Obama, right? Si Se Puede.
Yes.
And then over there is Education con Ganas, right? Educación con Ganas, right? And that's all. These are all his books too. So yeah, that's my cousin. His name's James Marin, Dr. James Marin. He's in education. So like I have a lot of educators in my family, like especially of like me and my cousins.
Oh my gosh, I know. And it's so inspiring. You inspire me, Denise. Is there anything that you want to tell Kansas City before we leave this podcast?
I am looking forward to going to Kansas City and hearing your stories and learning about Kansas City and talking about Chicano culture and low riding when I'm there.
Absolutely. And you're welcome anytime. I hope you like barbecue, because there's barbecue, the best barbecue out here is what we have to say.
I love barbecue. I do. Yeah.
Awesome. So thank you so much, Denise. We'll be in touch again soon. And thank you for all your amazing Chicano experience that you're bringing here to this forefront, and definitely the lowrider piece. It's just a part of my heart, and you bringing that to the forefront in such a beautiful way. We need to hear more of that, like, every day. So I just appreciate you
Well,
so much.
thank you. And thank you for the invitation and for making my first virtual podcast easy.
Hey, I'm an introvert. This is hard for me, so I'm glad we're friends. So this made it a lot easier. So thank you everybody for watching tonight. We'll be back again, and I appreciate everybody that's been contributing and being a part of this podcast. So thank you, everybody. Good night. Good night, Denise.
Good night.